In the autumn of 1895, a crew of 12 workers broke ground along the eastern seawall of Charleston, South Carolina, under an authorization that no municipal record would later acknowledge existed. The project was logged as routine drainage repair. The foreman, a man named Elias Croft, who had worked city infrastructure contracts since 1878, signed the daily labor sheets himself and kept a field log, as he always did, because that was the kind of man he was. Methodical, careful, the sort of foreman who would rather write something down twice than leave it unrecorded once. By the third day of digging, the crew had stopped filing their daily sheets. I came to this the way I come to nearly every one of these, through the side door. I was tracing the records of municipal construction projects across coastal cities in the 1890s, looking specifically at how post-Civil War urban expansion handled antebellum infrastructure, when a single line in a South Carolina state archive index stopped me cold. The entry read, Croft, E. Oral deposition, battery wall excavation, sealed per order of City Council, November 1895. There was no corresponding case file. There was no litigation record attached. There was no pending civic dispute, no property claim, no injury report. There was no explanation for why a drainage foreman's deposition would require sealing by City Council order. A deposition is a legal instrument. It is produced when testimony is needed for a proceeding. There was no proceeding on record. And that is the thing I have not been able to explain away, no matter how many adjacent files I have looked at. By the time this account is finished, you will understand exactly what that deposition contained, and why the city of Charleston has not authorized a single excavation along that stretch of seawall in the 130 years since. Consider first what the battery wall actually was in 1895. It was not decorative. It was not merely a promenade, though wealthy families walked it on summer evenings, and the view across the harbor was considered among the finest in the American South. The wall was a structural seawall built in the 1840s on top of earlier earthworks that dated, according to the best cartographic records available, to the late 1600s. Beneath those earthworks was fill, rubble, shell, ballast stone, the compacted debris of 2 centuries of port activity. That is what city engineers told the council the crew would find. Fill, debris, possibly old wooden pilings that needed replacing before the drainage channels could be properly graded. That is what Elias Croft's crew expected to find, and Croft was not a man who expected surprises. He had spent 17 years before his city contracts working private construction along the harbor, and before that he had been a ship's carpenter, which meant he knew timber. He knew how water worked against wood over time, and he knew what the ground near the water held and how long it held it. He was not easily startled, because what the crew encountered on the morning of the 4th day is not what any of them had been told to look for, and the fact that 12 men saw it and only one ever spoke about it publicly, and that one man spoke only in a deposition that was immediately sealed, is the part I keep returning to. The evidence ladder here begins not with what was found, but with what was covered over, and that distinction matters more than it might seem. A historian at the College of Charleston named Dr. Miriam Oates spent 11 years, between 1987 and 1998, attempting to reconstruct the 1895 excavation through indirect sources, contractor invoices, supply manifests, labor records held in private family collections. She published her findings in a 1999 monograph that received almost no attention outside of regional historical circles, which is itself a kind of answer about how these things are managed. She found 4 anomalies. The first anomaly, the labor payroll for the battery wall drainage project, which should have run 6 to 8 weeks based on the approved scope, terminates after 11 days. 11 days. Not completion, Not suspension for weather, not formal reassignment to another project. Simply stops, with no administrative note explaining the termination, and no record of the crew being deployed elsewhere in that period. The second anomaly, the project was listed as completed in city ledgers, but a separate set of drainage inspection reports from 1896 cite the same section of seawall as still requiring attention, meaning the drainage work was either not done or was actively undone after it was marked complete. The third anomaly, an invoice from a Savannah-based masonry supplier, shows a delivery of specialized hydraulic lime mortar to a Charleston city address in late October 1895, a material used not for drainage work, but for permanent vault construction. The city had no open vault project on record that month. None. The fourth anomaly is the one that Oates called the document I cannot place in any coherent administrative narrative. It is a requisition submitted by the Charleston City Engineer's Office on November 3, 1895, for 12 mahogany shipping crates, each measuring 4 feet by 2 feet by 18 inches, lined in oilskin. The requisition listed the purpose as preservation of recovered archival materials. 12 crates, one for each member of the crew. And there is no record of what archival materials were recovered, no inventory of what the crates contained, no shipping manifest listing a destination, no receipt from any receiving institution. Because in the public record, nothing was recovered. Nothing was found. The drainage repair was completed. The seawall was fine. And no one in the city government ever asked a single documented question about 12 oilskin-lined mahogany crates billed to a drainage project. Move forward now to the deposition itself, which I was able to access not through the Charleston City Archive, where it remains sealed under a classification that predates modern public records law and has never been challenged in court, but through a copy made by a private citizen who seems to have decided, quietly and without fanfare, that this was something that should not be entirely lost. In 2003, a retired attorney in Charleston named Howard Gaillard died, and his estate was liquidated. Among the papers purchased at the estate's sale by a document dealer and later donated to a small historical society in Summerville, South Carolina, was a handwritten transcription of what appears to be the Croft deposition. Gaillard had been a junior clerk at the city law office in 1895. He was 22 years old when the deposition was taken. He was in the room when Croft spoke. He made his transcription copies sometime in the following decade in a leather-bound notebook he kept among his personal papers for the rest of his 81 years. He told no one. He published nothing. He seems to have simply kept it, as though keeping it were a private obligation he had accepted and never found reason to abandon. The transcription runs to 31 handwritten pages. And what Elias Croft described to the City Council's legal representative on November 8, 1895, is this. At approximately 7 in the morning on October 19th, at a depth of approximately 9 feet below the base of the seawall's exterior face, the crew's excavation broke through a layer of compacted shell and struck a horizontal timber structure that did not match any known period of battery construction. The timbers were not rotted. That is the first thing Croft emphasized, and he returned to it several times in the deposition because he understood it was the hardest thing to accept without having seen it. In 9 feet of tidal-adjacent fill, in soil that should have been waterlogged and chemically corrosive for at least a century, the timbers were sound. He said the wood was dark, almost black, and that it carried a smell he described as cedar, or something older than cedar, something that had not been opened to air in a very long time, and that when the crew prized up the first section, they found beneath it not additional fill, but a sealed chamber, roughly 8 feet wide and of indeterminate length running parallel to the seawall, with interior walls that had been faced in a pale plaster the crew did not recognize as any compound they had worked with or seen in 40 years of combined labor on that waterfront. One of the crew members, a man named Joseph Radcliffe, who had worked with Croft for 9 years on harbor contracts, later told his daughter, and she told a journalist in 1961, who included it in a small circulation piece on Charleston folklore that I found in the Somerville Historical Society's files, along with Gaillard's notebook, that the first thing he noticed after the chamber was opened was that the air coming up from it was dry, not the damp, sulfur-tinged air of disturbed tidal fill. Dry, cool in the way a root cellar is cool when the door has been shut for a long winter. He said none of the men said anything for nearly a minute. They stood at the edge and looked down and did not speak. The crew did not panic. Croft was methodical. He noted the time in his field log, sent a runner to the city engineer's office, and instructed his men to hold position and touch nothing. They waited. The city engineer did not come. What arrived instead, according to the deposition, was a man Croft identified only as the gentleman from the council who arrived by private carriage within 40 minutes, which, given the distance from City Hall to the Battery in 1895 traffic and the state of those streets after rain, suggests strongly that he had been notified before the runner even reached the engineering office, that he was already moving before anyone officially told him to move. The gentleman from the council descended with a lantern. He spent approximately 10 minutes below grade. He came back up and told Croft to document nothing further and to resume normal operations, meaning to fill the breach and complete the drainage grading as originally scoped. Croft refused, not angrily, not dramatically. He told the representative that he had a professional obligation to document an unusual find before disturbing it, that he had followed that practice for 35 years on every project he had managed, and that he intended to follow it here regardless of instruction. The council representative told him that the chamber had been known to the city for some years and was not a discovery. He said its contents had already been catalogued by appropriate authorities, and that the crew's job was drainage, not archaeology. He used that word, archaeology, in 1895, before it had become standard administrative vocabulary in American municipal government. Croft found it strange enough to note it twice in the deposition, because in his experience people in positions of authority in city government did not use words they had not been given specifically to use because the statement was false, and Croft knew it was false, because the crew had already seen what was inside the chamber before anyone told them to stop looking. What Croft described, and what the crew confirmed during the brief window before the representative's arrival, was a series of objects arranged along the interior wall of the chamber on stone shelving cut directly into the chamber's structural material. Not wood shelving, not brick, but the same pale plaster material that lined the walls, formed into continuous ledges as though the chamber had been purpose-built around the objects rather than constructed first and filled later. He counted 9 objects on the visible section of shelving before he was told to stop counting. Each was roughly the size and shape of a large sealed vessel, closed at the top with what appeared to be a wax or resin compound, with markings on the exterior that were not English letters, and were not any decorative motif associated with European trade goods of any period he had encountered in nearly 40 years of working the soil of that city. Some of the markings were filled with a pigment that had not faded. Some were arranged in repetitive bands around the vessel neck, and then Croft said something that the council's legal representative underlined twice in the original document, according to Gaillard's transcription, with a line so firm it pressed through the page. He said, "I have worked in this city for 35 years, and I have seen what comes out of the ground here from every period. These did not come out of the ground. These were placed there. There is a difference, and any man who works the soil long enough knows it. The distinction he was drawing was precise and professional. Objects that have been in the ground for centuries accumulate a particular relationship with the earth around them. They sink. They tilt. Soil compresses around them unevenly, leaving marks that trained eyes read like text. The objects Croft described showed none of that. They were upright. They were level. The sediment around the base of the shelving was undisturbed in the way that sediment is undisturbed when something has been set on a dry, stable surface and then sealed from outside. The chamber did not read as burial. It read as storage. Deliberate, maintained, intended to be retrieved under conditions someone had thought carefully about. This is the part I keep returning to, because what you store and what you bury are different problems with different solutions, and whoever built that chamber had solved the storage problem with a sophistication that the 1895 understanding of the site's age made essentially inexplicable. The widening of this story is what makes it something more than a single local anomaly. Charleston was not alone. In 1887, workers laying foundation for a new customs house in Savannah, Georgia, broke into what the project foreman described in a letter to his brother. A letter held in a private family collection and later donated to the Georgia Historical Society as a room below the old Spanish works containing sealed vessels of foreign aspect that no man present could identify. The project was suspended for 3 weeks. When it resumed, the room appeared nowhere in the official construction report. No notation, no amendment, no asterisk. In 1901, 6 years after Charleston, a municipal drainage project in Mobile, Alabama, was halted for 11 days following what local newspaper accounts described only as an unexpected complication below the old French fortification line. No further explanation was ever published. The project foreman resigned 3 weeks after work resumed. In 1912, a construction crew digging a warehouse foundation near the old harbor works in Pensacola, Florida, struck what their employer described in a letter to the city permits office as a sealed passage of considerable age containing materials we are not equipped to assess. The permits office replied in writing within 4 days, instructing the crew to proceed and to consider the matter closed. 4 days. From a permits office. For a report of a sealed passage of considerable age. These 4 cities sit on a coastal arc following almost exactly the line of Spanish colonial activity in the southeastern United States between the 1560s and the 1760s. They are the cities where the earliest sustained European presence was not English, but Spanish, where colonial authority was divided among religious, military, and commercial institutions that maintained entirely separate record systems, some archived in Rome, some in Seville, and some that have never been located in any collection anywhere on Earth. I am not telling you what was in those vessels. I am telling you that sealed chambers, containing objects described in strikingly consistent terms by trained workers in 4 separate cities, were found within a 30-year window along the same colonial coastline, and that in each case the municipal response followed an identical pattern. Halt. Assess privately. Seal the record. Resume construction. Never dig there again. That is not a theory. It is in the administrative records of 4 separate municipal governments, none of which has any documented communication with the others about these incidents. And that uniformity of response, that identical, unrehearsed instinct to close the record and move forward, is what separates this from coincidence and places it in a category I have not found a satisfying name for. What was lost in 1895 along the Charleston Battery Wall is not recoverable. The chamber was filled. The hydraulic lime mortar from Savannah sealed the breach permanently. The 12 mahogany crates were shipped to destinations no surviving document names. Elias Croft died in 1903, 8 years after the excavation, having never spoken publicly about what his crew found. His field log from October 1895 is not in the South Carolina State Archives, the Charleston County Records, or the College of Charleston Library. It does not appear to exist anywhere. Howard Gaillard kept his transcription hidden for 60 years, told no one, and when he died the notebook passed through a document dealer before arriving, unrecognized, in a small historical society in Somerville that had no idea what it held. There is a version of this story where everything was ordinary, where city governments in the 1890s sealed unusual finds, not because they understood what they had found, but precisely because they did not, and chose the path of least disruption rather than the path of documentation. That version is possible. It requires you to accept that the same choice was made in 4 cities, along the same coastline, within 30 years, with no communication between the decision-makers and no public accounting ever offered. If you know someone who has walked the Battery Promenade in Charleston and looked out at that harbor and wondered what the old city is built on top of and why no one ever seems curious about it, share this with them. Because Elias Croft was curious. He was a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read what the ground holds, and he knew the difference between something buried by time and something stored with intention. What he tried to say on the record in November of 1895 is still sitting in a sealed deposition that no living person is permitted to read, in a city that has not broken ground along that seawall since, and has never publicly said why.